parchment burned against Lyra Ashworth's palm the moment the two seals touched. A hiss of white smoke curled upward, and the old vault beneath the palace library shuddered, as if something ancient had opened one eye and taken notice. Lyra yanked her hand back, heart slamming, and stared at the twin marks glowing faintly on the table before her. One seal was the color of dried wine, the other black as a moonless sky, and where their edges met, thin threads of light stitched themselves across the stone floor, like veins waking up after a long sleep. She had only meant to compare them, that was all. A simple study, a quiet afternoon of scholarly curiosity, in the deepest, driest corner of the archive where no one ever came. Instead, the air had turned thick and warm, and somewhere far above her, she heard the heavy iron door of the vault groan, though she had locked it herself only minutes before. Footsteps, fast ones, boots on stone, more than one pair, coming down the spiral stairs that led into the vault. Lyra swept both parchments off the table and pressed them flat against her chest, wrapping her shawl around them before the guards reached the bottom step. Her fingers trembled, not from fear of the men approaching, but from the strange warmth still pulsing beneath the fabric, as though the seals had a heartbeat of their own now. Miss Ashworth. The voice belonged to Felix Cross, captain of the palace guard, a broad man with a face carved from patience and suspicion in equal measure. He held a lantern high, and its light caught the sheen of sweat on his brow. "You should not be down here, not tonight." "I was cataloging," Lyra said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The old ledgers, nothing more." Felix's eyes moved past her, toward the table, toward the faint golden dust still settling in the air, like the last breath of a spell. He said nothing about it, but his jaw tightened, and Lyra understood, in that instant, that he had felt it too. Whatever had happened when the seals touched, it had reached far beyond this small stone room. The whole east wing felt something, he said quietly. A tremor. Glass cracked in the king's own chambers. He wants to know why. Lyra's stomach dropped. She had read enough fragments of old law to know that a tremor in the east wing, on a night with no storm and no earthquake in the histories, meant only one thing to the people of this kingdom: old magic, blood magic, the kind that was supposed to have died out generations ago, sealed away along with the war that nearly tore the Lycan bloodline in half. "I need to see what is under your shawl," Felix said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that Lyra knew refusal was not truly an option. She hesitated only a moment, before deciding that hiding the truth from a guard captain who already suspected her would be far more dangerous than showing him a fragment of it. She drew back one corner of the fabric, just enough to reveal the edge of the crimson seal, its wax cracked with age, its symbol unlike anything taught in any royal school. Felix's lantern hand did not move, but his face went pale in the warm light. "Where did you find that?" "Beneath the false floor in the Western Archive. It was hidden with old census scrolls, forgotten for 100 years, maybe more." She swallowed. "There is a second one. I found it wedged behind a support beam 3 days ago. I only wanted to know if they were connected." "And are they?" Lyra thought of the threads of light stitching across the floor, of the way the room had seemed to hold its breath. "I do not know yet, but something woke up when they touched." Felix exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a growl caught halfway in his throat. "Then you will come with me. Now. Before anyone else feels what the castle just felt and starts asking questions we cannot yet answer." They climbed the spiral stairs together, Lyra clutching the parchments to her chest, Felix's lantern throwing long, restless shadows against the curved stone walls. At the top, the corridor that led toward the main hall was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that comes after people have been told to stay in their rooms. Somewhere distant, she heard hurried voices, servants moving with lanterns of their own, and the low murmur of the court trying to make sense of a shaking that had no earthly cause. Lyra had grown up hearing stories about the founding pact between the human court and the Lycan bloodline, a peace bought with blood and sealed with magic, so old that most scholars believed it existed only in legend. She had spent 3 years studying under Beatrice Sinclair, the head royal archivist, memorizing every surviving fragment of that history, and never once had she come across mention of 2 seals. Every account, every faded record, spoke of a single pact, a single mark that bound the kingdoms together after a war that nearly destroyed them both. If there were 2 seals, then somewhere along the way, someone had rewritten history, and someone had done it on purpose. They reached a narrow servants' corridor that Felix clearly knew far better than she did, weaving through it, until they emerged near the private study, usually reserved for the royal steward. He shut the door behind them and set his lantern on a low table, finally allowing his shoulders to drop from their rigid line. "You do not understand what you have found," he said, "or perhaps you do, and that is worse." "Enlighten me then," Lyra said, trying to keep the shake out of her voice. Felix studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth she could carry without breaking beneath it. "There is a reason the Lycan king does not speak of his brother. There is a reason certain names have been struck from the court records. If what you are holding is what I fear it is, then you have found the second half of a wound the kingdom has spent 100 years trying to forget." Before Lyra could ask what he meant, the door swung open without a knock, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop and rise all at once, the way air does before a storm breaks. King Cale Draven stood in the doorway, tall and unhurried, his eyes the pale amber of a wolf caught between shapes. He wore no crown, only a dark coat still damp from whatever business had pulled him from his own chambers, and his gaze went immediately to the shawl bundled in Lyra's arms. "Captain," he said, his voice low and even, though there was an edge beneath it sharp enough to cut. "You found her." "Yes, Your Majesty. In the old vault. She had 2 seals in her possession when the tremor struck." Cale's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition mixed with something closer to dread. He stepped further into the room, and Lyra felt an instinct rise in her chest, half fear and half fascination, the kind of feeling that made her want to step back and lean forward at the same time. "Show me," he said. Lyra unwrapped the shawl fully this time, laying both parchments on the table between them. The crimson seal and the black one sat side by side, their symbols nearly mirror images of each other, as though carved by the same hand, with 2 very different intentions. Cale's breath caught, just slightly, just enough that Lyra noticed. "Where did the second one come from?" he asked. "I found it hidden in the Western Archive, sealed behind a support beam. The wood around it was scorched, as if someone had tried to burn it once and failed." Cale reached out, but stopped his hand just above the black seal, not quite touching it, as though even the nearness of it cost him something. "This mark does not belong to any pact recorded in your histories, Miss Ashworth. It belongs to my brother." The room went very still. Even Felix seemed to hold his breath. "Your brother," Lyra repeated carefully, "is not mentioned in any surviving record I have studied." "Because I had every mention of him removed," Cale said, and there was no pride in the admission, only a tired kind of honesty. "Ronan broke from our bloodline before I took the crown. He believed the peace between our kinds was a mistake, a leash placed on a power that should never have been tamed. He tried to forge his own claim using a seal of his own making, one meant to unravel the original pact rather than honor it. And you stopped him." "I thought I had," Cale said quietly. "I believed his seal was destroyed the night he vanished from the kingdom. If it survived, hidden all these years in your archive, then someone placed it there deliberately, waiting for the day it might be found and joined with mine." Lyra looked down at the 2 parchments, understanding beginning to settle over her like cold water. "You mean these are not 2 separate seals at all? They are 2 halves of the same broken oath." "Yes," Cale said, and for the first time, real fear moved across his composed features. "And when they touch, even for a moment, they begin trying to become whole again. If they ever fully merge, Miss Ashworth, they will not simply reveal a secret history. They will finish what my brother started. They will tear this kingdom apart exactly as he intended, and there will be no stopping it a second time." Lyra felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. She had come to the vault seeking knowledge, a scholar's simple hunger to understand a fragment of forgotten history. She had not imagined that her discovery would place her at the center of a war that had never truly ended, only slept, waiting for someone curious enough to wake it. Felix shifted near the door, clearly uneasy at how much his king had already revealed to a stranger. But Cale did not seem to notice or care. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra, searching her face for something she could not name. "You need to hide these seals again," Felix said finally, breaking the silence. "Separate them. Bury them somewhere no one will think to look, and pray the tremor tonight does not draw attention we cannot afford." "No," Cale said, and both Lyra and Felix turned to him in surprise. Hiding them worked for 100 years, until it did not. If my brother's people are searching for the second seal, then hiding it again only buys us time, not safety. We need to understand exactly what these marks do before someone else forces them together with worse intentions than curiosity. His gaze shifted to Lyra, steady and unreadable. You are the only person in this kingdom who has studied both symbols closely enough to notice they are connected. Whether you meant to or not, Miss Ashworth, you have already stepped into the middle of this. The question now is whether you intend to walk back out, or whether you will help me understand what my brother truly intended, before it destroys everything my family bled to protect. Lyra looked down at the two seals resting side by side on the table, their faint light finally beginning to fade, though the warmth beneath her skin had not. She thought of the tremor that had cracked glass in the king's own chambers, of the fear on Felix's face, of the century-old secret her simple curiosity had just cracked wide open. Walking away no longer felt like a choice that existed for her. "Tell me everything," she said. "If I am already part of this, then I refuse to be part of it blindly." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind the wariness in his amber eyes. "Very well," he said. "But be warned, Miss Ashworth. Once you know the full truth of what my brother did, and what these seals are capable of, there will be no forgetting it, and no safe corner of this kingdom left to hide from it." Outside, the palace bells began to ring, calling the court to gather, calling the guards to their posts, calling every soul within the walls to wonder what force had shaken their world in the middle of an ordinary night. Lyra Ashworth stood at the center of it, two ancient seals cooling on the table before her, and understood, with a certainty that chilled her more than any tremor could, that whatever came next would change everything she thought she knew about the kingdom she called home. The candle beside Lyra's desk had burned down to a stub, but she did not notice until wax spilled over the edge and hardened against her sleeve. 3 days had passed since the tremor shook the palace, 3 days of forced calm, while rumors spread through the halls like smoke under a door. Officially, the court had been told a storage room in the old wing had partially collapsed. Unofficially, every servant, every guard, every noble with sharp enough ears knew that something far stranger had happened, and no one dared ask the king directly what it was. Lyra had been given a small office 2 floors below the royal library, a space Cale insisted on so that her research could continue without drawing attention from the wider court. It was there, surrounded by borrowed ledgers and fragile scrolls smuggled up from the vault under Felix's careful watch, that she nearly missed the sound of the door opening behind her. "You should lock that," said a familiar voice, and Lyra spun to find Clara Whitmore leaning against the frame, arms crossed, an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. Clara was the only other archivist young enough to still remember what sunlight looked like outside the library, and the only person in the palace who had noticed Lyra's sudden disappearance from her usual duties. "I did lock it," Lyra said, glancing at the door. "Not well enough." Clara stepped inside and shut it firmly behind her. "People are asking where you have been, Lyra. Beatrice covered for you twice this week already, and she is not going to keep doing it forever without an explanation." Lyra hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her friend from danger and the exhaustion of carrying a secret this heavy alone. Clara noticed the hesitation immediately, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Whatever this is," Clara said, softer now, "you look like you have not slept properly in days. Let me help, or at least let me worry about you properly, instead of guessing in the dark." Lyra glanced at the stack of documents on her desk, records Cale had personally authorized her to access, fragments of history that had been deliberately buried by his own order 100 years ago. She thought of Felix's warning about how dangerous this knowledge could be, and she thought of Clara's steady friendship, the kind that had never once wavered, even when Lyra buried herself in work for weeks at a time. "Sit down," Lyra said finally. "But once I tell you, you cannot unknow it." Clara sat, and Lyra explained as much as she dared, the 2 seals, the tremor, the existence of a brother the king had erased from every record. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to quiet dread by the time Lyra finished. "A hidden war," Clara said slowly. "Hidden so well that even the archive has no trace of it." "Almost no trace," Lyra corrected, pulling a thin, water-stained ledger from the bottom of her pile. "I found this yesterday. buried among old tax records from the border villages. It is not a royal document. It was written by a village clerk, someone with no reason to lie or embellish for the crown's benefit. She opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of faded ribbon and turned it toward Clara. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, clearly written under pressure, describing a season nearly 100 years past, when two Lycan clans had turned against each other in the hills beyond the eastern border. The clerk wrote of livestock found torn apart in the night, of entire households abandoning their homes overnight, of a fear so thick that even the village priest refused to hold services after dark. Two clans, Clara murmured, reading over Lyra's shoulder. Not one kingdom against the humans. Two Lycan bloodlines fighting each other. That is what I thought too at first, Lyra said. But look at the next passage. She turned the page, revealing a section where the clerk described a night when the fighting suddenly stopped, when both clans seemed to retreat at once, as though called back by some silent command, and when a single rider passed through the village afterward, wearing a crimson mark upon his chest. The seal, Clara whispered. I believe the war was never between the Lycans and the humans at all, Lyra said. I believe it was a war within the bloodline itself, between those who supported peace with the human court and those who did not. And I believe the pact everyone celebrates as the founding treaty of this kingdom was never a treaty between two different peoples. It was a treaty forced between two halves of the same family. Clara sat back, absorbing the weight of what that meant. If that is true, then the entire history taught in every school in this kingdom is a lie, built to hide a family's fracture. Not just any family, Lyra said quietly, the royal one. A knock at the door made them both jump. Lyra quickly closed the ledger and slid it beneath a stack of unrelated papers, just as Felix Cross let himself in, his expression grim, in a way that made Lyra's stomach twist before he even spoke. You need to come with me, he said, glancing briefly at Clara with a look of measured caution. Both of you, if she already knows what you know. What has happened? Lyra asked, rising quickly. A rider was caught at the eastern gate an hour ago, trying to enter the palace grounds under a false name. When the guards searched him, they found a fragment of parchment sewn into the lining of his coat. Felix's jaw tightened. It bears the same black mark as the seal you found in the Western Archive. Lyra's blood ran cold. Someone is already searching for it. Someone already knows it exists, Felix corrected, which means either your discovery was not as private as we hoped, or your brother's people have had eyes on this palace for far longer than any of us realized. They moved quickly through the corridors, Clara trailing close behind, despite Felix's clear discomfort at her presence, until they reached a small guarded chamber near the palace's eastern wing. Inside, a man sat bound to a chair, his clothing torn from the struggle of his capture, his eyes darting nervously between the guards stationed at the door. He was younger than Lyra expected, barely older than herself, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had not planned on being caught. Cale stood near the far wall, arms crossed, watching the prisoner with an expression carved from ice. When Lyra entered, his gaze flicked briefly to her, before returning to the man in the chair. Tell her what you told me, Cale said, his voice deceptively calm. The prisoner swallowed hard. I was sent to deliver a message, nothing more. I did not know what the fragment meant, only that I was told to leave it with a contact inside the palace grounds. Who sent you? Lyra asked, stepping closer despite Felix's hand hovering protectively near her arm. I do not know his true name, the man said. We call him only the Warden. He leads a group that has been searching for something hidden within these walls for years. When word came that a tremor shook the palace 3 nights past, he grew desperate, convinced that whatever we sought had finally been disturbed. And this Warden, Cale said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. Does he serve my brother? The prisoner's eyes widened slightly, fear flashing across his face at the mention of Ronan's name, though he tried to mask it quickly. I only know that the Warden speaks of an old promise, one made long before any of us were born. He believes the Black Seal belongs to him by right, and he intends to reclaim what was stolen from his bloodline. Lyra glanced at Cale, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten at the phrase, stolen from his bloodline, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that this conflict ran far deeper than a single broken family. It was a wound passed down through generations, nursed and sharpened by those who believed the original peace had cost them something precious. Lock him in the lower cells, Kale said finally, turning away from the prisoner with visible effort. Treat him fairly, but do not let him near a window or a messenger bird. If the warden believes his rider succeeded, he may hesitate before sending another. As the guards led the prisoner away, Kale turned to Lyra, his expression heavier now, weighted by the confirmation of fears he had clearly hoped would never come true. They know, he said quietly. Whoever leads them, whatever they call themselves now, they know the seals have been disturbed, and they will not stop searching until they find them. Then we cannot simply study these marks in secret anymore, Lyra said. We need to understand exactly what they do, and quickly, before this warden, or anyone working for him, finds a way inside these walls. Kale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his amber eyes. There is someone who might know more than either of us, he said finally. An old advisor who served my father before me. Someone who was present during the last years of the conflict between my brother and our bloodline. I have avoided speaking with him about this for years, hoping the past would simply stay buried. But now, Lyra asked. Now I no longer have the luxury of hope, Kale said. Tomorrow, we will visit Edmund Hale. If anyone in this kingdom can explain what my brother truly intended when he forged that seal, it will be him. Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of the coming days settle over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Beside her, Clara reached out and squeezed her hand once, a small, steady gesture of support that meant more than words could have managed. Outside the small chamber, the palace continued its quiet routines, unaware that somewhere beyond its walls, a man called the Warden was already planning his next move, and that the peace built a century ago on a foundation of secrets was beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to crack. Edmund Hale's study smelled of old paper and something faintly metallic, a scent Lyra could not place, until she noticed the thin scar running along his left hand as he poured tea with practiced steadiness. He was older than she expected, his hair silver at the temples, his eyes sharp despite the gentle stoop of his shoulders, and the moment Kale introduced her, Edmund's gaze lingered on her face a fraction too long, as though measuring her against some memory only he could see. So you are the one who found the second seal, Edmund said, setting the teapot down with careful precision. I confess, part of me hoped that particular ghost would remain buried forever. You knew it still existed, Kale said, and it was not a question. Edmund's hand stilled. I suspected. I was there, Your Majesty, the night your brother vanished with his mark half finished. I watched your father's soldiers search every corner of the Western Territories for it, and when they found nothing, I assumed either it had been destroyed in the chaos, or it had been hidden so well that no one would ever stumble upon it again. His eyes flicked to Lyra. It seems I underestimated the persistence of a curious scholar. Lyra shifted under his gaze, uncertain whether his words carried admiration or accusation. I need to understand what my discovery has set in motion, she said. Not just the history, but the danger. What exactly happens if the two seals are ever fully joined? Edmund exhaled slowly, setting his teacup aside untouched. To understand that, you must first understand what the original pact truly was. Your histories call it a treaty between the human court and the Lycan bloodline, and in a distant sense, that is true. But the deeper truth, the one buried beneath a century of careful rewriting, is that the pact was forged to end a war within the bloodline itself. I found records suggesting the same thing, Lyra said. A village clerk's account of two clans fighting each other, not humans and Lycans. Edmund nodded slowly. The bloodline was never truly unified, not even before the humans arrived to settle these lands. There were always two schools of thought among the Lycan clans. One believed that peace with the human kingdoms was the only path to survival, that a shared future was worth the compromise of restraint and shared rule. The other believed that restraint was a weakness, that the bloodline's true strength lay in embracing its nature fully, without the chains of human law or human fear. My brother believed the latter, Kale said quietly. He did not simply believe it, Edmund said. He was raised believing it, taught by voices within our own court, who never accepted your father's decision to honor the peace. Ronan was a brilliant young man, Your Majesty, more gifted with the old magic than any Lycan born in 3 generations. It made him dangerous, and it made him easy to convince that he alone could restore what he saw as his people's rightful power. Lyra leaned forward. And the seal he created? The original pact was sealed with a single mark, drawn from both bloodlines and both intentions, human restraint and Lycan strength, bound together in balance. Your brother believed that balance was a cage. He spent years secretly studying the old rites, attempting to forge a second mark, one meant to unravel the balance entirely and release the full strength of the bloodline without the counterweight of the human pact. To what end? Lyra asked. To reshape the kingdom entirely, Edmund said, not merely to break the treaty, but to erase it, to return the land to a time before humans and Lycans shared any borders at all. He believed such a return would be a mercy, a correction of what he saw as 100 years of unnecessary restraint. Cale's expression had gone rigid, old grief and old anger warring visibly across his features. He nearly succeeded, he said. The night he vanished, half the eastern territories had already begun to feel the effects of his unfinished ritual. Crops failed without cause. Livestock turned wild overnight. It took every remaining loyalist among our bloodline, working alongside your father's soldiers, to contain the damage before it spread further. And you believed his seal was destroyed in that containment, Lyra said. We believed many things that night, Cale said quietly. Belief, it seems, was not enough. Edmund studied them both for a long moment before continuing. If the two seals were ever brought together fully, not merely touched in passing as happened 3 nights ago, but truly merged through the proper rite, the effect would not simply mirror what happened the night Ronan vanished. It would complete what he started. The balance holding this kingdom together would shatter entirely, and the old strength of the bloodline, unrestrained and unchecked, would return in full. Lyra asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. It would mean the end of everything built upon that pact, Edmund said simply. Every border drawn since the peace, every law governing how humans and Lycans share these lands, every family formed across that divide in the century since. All of it exists because the original seal holds a careful balance. Break that balance, and you do not simply lose a treaty. You lose the foundation the entire kingdom now stands upon. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over all 3 of them. Lyra thought of the tremor that had cracked glass in the king's own chambers, a mere echo of contact between the seals, and tried to imagine what true completion of the ritual might unleash. The god of the thought made her hands cold despite the warmth of the tea Edmund had poured, and none of them had touched. The man captured at the eastern gate, Cale said finally. He spoke of someone called the Warden, leading a group searching for the Black Seal. Does that name mean anything to you? Edmund's expression flickered, just briefly, before settling back into careful neutrality. The Warden, he repeated slowly. I have not heard that title in many years. There were always those among your brother's followers who remained loyal to his vision, even after he vanished, scattered remnants who believed he would return one day, to finish what he started. If one of them has taken up a title like the Warden, it suggests an organization, a structure built specifically around recovering what your brother left behind. Could Ronan himself be alive? Lyra asked. I do not know, Edmund said, and for the first time, genuine uncertainty colored his voice. No body was ever found. No confirmation of his death ever reached the court. It was simply assumed, over the years, that he had perished somewhere in the wilderness, beyond the eastern border, unable to survive alone after losing his followers and his seal. Cale's jaw tightened at the possibility, old wounds clearly reopening beneath his composed exterior. If he is alive, and if this Warden serves him still, then whoever sent that rider to the palace gate did not act out of blind hope. They acted because they believe my brother is close to finishing what he began, and they needed only the missing half of his seal to make it possible. Lyra felt the full weight of her discovery settle over her at last, heavier than any history book, heavier than any warning Felix had given her in that quiet study 3 nights ago. She had come to the vault seeking only knowledge, and instead she had handed a desperate movement, the one piece of hope they had been searching for, across an entire generation. We need to move the seals somewhere no one could ever find them, she said. Somewhere beyond even the reach of this Warden, and whatever remains of your brother's followers. Hiding them again only delays the danger, Cale said, echoing what he had told her days before. We need to understand the exact rite my brother intended, so that we know precisely what to guard against, and precisely how to stop it, should the seals ever fall into the wrong hands despite our best efforts. Edmund rose slowly from his chair, moving toward a locked cabinet at the far side of the study. There may be a way, he said, retrieving a small brass key from beneath his collar. Your father, your majesty, did not destroy every record of that night. Some things were kept, not for public knowledge, but for exactly this possibility, that the danger might one day return and require understanding rather than mere containment. He unlocked the cabinet and withdrew a slim, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age, and set it carefully on the table between them. This belonged to your father, Edmund said quietly, written in the final months before the containment, describing everything he learned about your brother's intentions and the rite he attempted to complete. I have kept it safe all these years, hoping it would never need to be opened again. Cale stared at the journal for a long moment before reaching out and drawing it toward himself, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the worn leather. Lyra watched the weight of a father's final warnings settle onto a son's shoulders, and understood, with quiet certainty, that whatever answers lay within those pages would shape everything that came next. The journal's pages crackled with age as Cale turned them, and more than once his hand paused mid-motion, as though the ink itself carried the weight of memory rather than mere words. Lyra sat across from him in the small private study Cale had claimed for their work, candlelight flickering over the worn leather cover, and she found herself watching his face nearly as often as she watched the pages, searching for clues to a grief he rarely allowed to surface. My father wrote almost daily during those final months, Cale said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. He rarely spoke of that time when I was young. I always assumed it was simply too painful. Now I wonder if he was also afraid of what he might reveal, if he let himself remember too clearly. What does he say about the rite itself? Lyra asked, leaning forward despite herself. Cale found the page he had been searching for, and turned the journal toward her, though his eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the candlelight. Lyra read carefully, translating the old formal script in her mind as she went, and felt a chill spread through her chest with each line. According to the late king's account, Ronan's rite required not merely the joining of the two seals, but a specific sequence of conditions that had to align precisely. The seals needed to be brought together beneath a particular alignment of stars that occurred only once every several years, in a location where the old bloodline magic still ran closest to the surface of the earth, and the ritual required a willing bearer from each half of the original pact, one of human blood and one of Lycan blood, to complete the binding. A willing bearer, Lyra murmured, from each side of the treaty. My father believed Ronan intended to use himself as the Lycan bearer, Cale said. As for the human half, the journal suggests he had already convinced someone within the human court to join him, someone who believed, as he did, that the peace treaty had cost the kingdom more than it had gained. Does your father name this person? Cale turned several more pages before shaking his head slowly. He refers to them only as the human conspirator. Either he never learned their identity, or he chose deliberately not to record it, perhaps to protect someone, or perhaps because the truth was too dangerous to commit to paper even in a private journal. Lyra sat back, absorbing the implications. If the rite required a willing human bearer, then whoever this warden served, whether Ronan himself or one of his most devoted followers, would need to find or create a modern equivalent of that original conspirator, someone from within the current human court, willing to betray the peace their ancestors had built. That is why the Black Seal was hidden in the human archive, she realized aloud. Not merely for safekeeping. Someone placed it there deliberately, perhaps hoping it would eventually fall into the hands of someone sympathetic to your brother's cause, someone who could serve as the human half of the rite when the time came. Cale's expression darkened further. If that is true, then whoever hid that seal in your archive was playing a very long game indeed, one spanning generations, waiting patiently for the right person to stumble upon it. Or the wrong person, Lyra said quietly, depending on which side of this conflict you stand. A knock interrupted them, sharp and urgent, and Felix Cross entered without waiting for permission, his expression tight with barely restrained alarm. Your Majesty, there has been a break-in at the Western Archive. 2 of the night guards were found unconscious near the false floor, where the Black Seal was originally hidden. Lyra's stomach dropped. Did they take anything? Nothing was left behind to take, Felix said grimly. Whoever searched that space clearly already knew the seal had been moved. I believe they were searching for records instead, anything that might reveal where it was taken, or who had discovered it. Cale rose immediately, closing the journal with careful reverence before tucking it beneath his arm. This confirms it. The warden's people are not merely searching blindly. They have eyes inside this palace, or at the very least, eyes close enough to know precisely where to look. Someone within the court, Lyra said, the realization settling over her uncomfortably. Someone with access to the archive's layout. Someone who knew which section housed the census records where the Black Seal was hidden. That narrows the possibilities considerably, Felix said, but it does not narrow them enough. Half the senior staff in this palace could name that section from memory. Cale turned to Lyra, his expression grave. From this moment forward, you cannot continue working in that small office alone. If they know enough to search the archive itself, they may soon learn enough to search for you specifically. I am not going to hide, Lyra said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. If I disappear from my usual duties entirely, it will only draw more attention, and it will accomplish nothing, except making me feel useless, while everyone else continues the real work. I am not suggesting you hide, Cale said. I am suggesting you no longer work alone. Felix cleared his throat. I could assign guards to escort her between the library and her quarters. That will draw exactly the kind of attention we are trying to avoid, Lyra said. A scholar surrounded by armed guards raises more questions than it answers. Cale studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his amber eyes. Then perhaps the solution is simpler than either of you are considering. If Miss Ashworth continues her research openly, but under my direct supervision rather than in secret, it will appear as though the Crown has simply taken an interest in an unusually gifted archivist's work. Nothing more suspicious than a king indulging a scholarly curiosity of his own. You mean work beside me, Lyra said slowly. Openly. I mean protect you without appearing to, Cale said. The warden's people, whoever they are, will think twice before attempting anything against someone under the Crown's direct and visible attention, and it will allow me to continue studying my father's journal, without arousing suspicion about why the king suddenly cares so deeply about old census records. Lyra considered the proposal, weighing the practical wisdom of it against a quieter, more unsettled feeling stirring beneath her ribs at the thought of spending her days working closely beside the Lycan king himself. She told herself the feeling was simply nerves, the natural unease of proximity to power, but some honest corner of her mind suspected it ran deeper than that. Very well, she said finally, but I expect to be treated as a scholar in this partnership, not as a piece to be protected and moved about a board without a voice of my own. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of Cale's mouth, brief and unguarded before his usual composure reasserted itself. I would expect nothing less, Miss Ashworth. Your voice, it seems, is precisely what led us to this discovery in the first place. It would be foolish of me to silence it now. Felix watched the exchange with an expression Lyra could not quite read, somewhere between approval and quiet concern, before excusing himself to organize the palace's response to the break-in. When the door closed behind him, an unexpected quiet settled over the study, broken only by the soft crackle of the candle between them. Thank you, Lyra said finally, for trusting me with this, rather than shutting me out entirely. You earned that trust the moment you chose to tell me the truth about the second seal instead of hiding it, Cale said. Trust is not something I offer easily, Miss Ashworth, but it is something I recognize when it has been earned. Lyra held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them before she looked away, gathering the scattered papers on the table to steady her own thoughts. Whatever was beginning to grow between them, whether trust, partnership, or something quieter and more dangerous still unnamed, it would have to wait. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a man called the Warden was drawing closer, and the Black Seal that had slept forgotten for 100 years was no longer safely out of reach. Glass shattered somewhere below the study window, and Lyra was on her feet before she fully understood why, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Cale moved faster, crossing the room in 2 strides and pulling her back from the window, just as a second projectile struck the outer wall, close enough that she felt the vibration through the stone floor beneath her feet. Stay down, he said, his voice low and controlled, despite the sudden tension coiled through his frame. Outside, shouts rose from the courtyard below, guards scrambling toward the source of the disturbance. Cale moved to the window's edge, careful to stay clear of the opening itself, and peered down at the chaos unfolding in the darkness beyond the glass. Someone attempted to breach the outer wall near the garden entrance, he said after a tense moment. Felix's men are already responding. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she straightened, adrenaline still coursing hot through her veins. Do you think this is connected to the warden? I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if it were not, Cale said grimly. They waited in tense silence until Felix arrived minutes later, his uniform dusted with debris, a shallow cut along his temple that he seemed entirely unbothered by. 2 intruders, he reported. Both fled before we could apprehend them, but they left this behind. He held out a small, blackened stone, its surface etched with a symbol similar to the mark on the Black Seal, though cruder, less refined, as though carved in haste by someone with only partial knowledge of the original design. A signal stone, Cale murmured, taking it carefully from Felix's palm, meant to be thrown against the palace wall, likely to test our defenses or confirm which section of the building held their target. They were aiming for this study, Lyra realized, a fresh chill running through her. They know we are working here. Then we move the work again, Felix said firmly, somewhere less predictable. Cale turned the stone over in his hand, studying its rough symbol with an unreadable expression. Or we let them believe their guess was correct, while we quietly relocate everything that matters. A study left visibly occupied, with nothing valuable remaining inside it, wastes their effort, and buys us time to think more carefully about our next move. It took the better part of the following day to arrange, but by evening, Lyra found herself in a windowless chamber, deep within the oldest part of the palace, a room once used to store ceremonial garments, and now repurposed with borrowed shelves, and a heavy iron door that Felix personally inspected twice, before allowing anyone to work inside it. Cale's father's journal sat on the central table, alongside Lyra's own notes, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe without the constant awareness of watching eyes. This feels safer, she admitted, settling into one of the 2 chairs Cale had arranged across from each other, rather than side by side, an arrangement she suspected was deliberate, though she could not decide whether it was meant to preserve propriety or simply to allow him to watch her expressions more easily as they worked. Safer, but not entirely safe, Cale said. Nowhere in this palace is entirely safe anymore, it seems. They worked in companionable quiet for a while, cross-referencing Lyra's translated fragments against the journal's account of Ronan's right, until Lyra noticed Cale's attention drifting, his eyes fixed on the middle distance rather than the page before him. You are thinking of him, she said gently. Your brother. Cale's jaw tightened, though he did not deny it. I have spent years trying not to think of him at all. It was easier that way, treating him as a closed chapter, rather than an open wound. Your discovery has made that considerably more difficult. What was he like? Lyra asked. Before all of this, before the war within your own bloodline. Something in Cale's expression softened, just slightly, memory pulling at the edges of his usual composure. Brilliant, he said quietly. Restless, in a way I never quite understood as a boy. He questioned everything. Our father's decisions, the court's traditions, the very foundation of the peace we had been taught to celebrate since childhood. I used to admire that about him, before I understood how dangerous unchecked questioning could become when paired with real power. Did you ever try to convince him he was wrong? Many times, Cale said. He always had an answer ready, always framed his ambitions as a kind of liberation rather than destruction. It was only near the end, when I saw the damage his half-finished right had already caused in the Eastern Territories, that I understood he had stopped seeing people as anything other than obstacles or tools in service of his vision. And you have carried the guilt of that ever since, not simply losing a brother, but failing to stop him before it went as far as it did. Cale's eyes met hers, something raw flickering behind his usual guarded calm. You see quite clearly, for someone who has known me only a matter of days, Miss Ashworth. Perhaps grief looks similar on most people, Lyra said softly, regardless of how carefully they try to hide it behind duty and titles. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something neither of them seemed ready to name aloud. Finally, Cale broke it, his voice quieter than she had yet heard it. I did not expect this, he admitted, working alongside someone who challenges me as readily as she supports me. Most within this court either fear me too much to speak honestly, or flatter me too readily to be trusted. You do neither. I am not interested in flattering kings, Lyra said, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips, despite the gravity of their circumstances. I am interested in understanding the truth, wherever it leads. Even when the truth leads somewhere as dangerous as this? Especially then, she said. A comfortable lie has never once stopped a real threat from arriving at someone's door. Cale studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing briefly across his features before he seemed to catch himself, drawing his attention back to the journal between them with visible effort. We should continue, he said, though his voice carried a reluctance that suggested some part of him would have preferred to let the quiet moment stretch longer. They returned to their work, tracing the journal's account of the star alignment required for Ronan's rite, cross-referencing it against Lyra's astronomical charts, until they found a passage that made both of them go still. The alignment described here, Lyra said slowly, running her finger along the relevant star chart, occurs only once every several years, exactly as your father's journal suggested. According to my calculations, the next occurrence falls within the coming month. Cale's expression darkened considerably. Then whoever leads the Warden's people is not merely searching for the Black Seal out of old loyalty or lingering hope. They are working toward a specific, rapidly approaching deadline. If they do not recover the seal before that alignment passes, Lyra said, they will need to wait years for another opportunity. Which means they will grow more desperate, not less, as the days remaining continue to shrink, Cale said grimly. We no longer have the luxury of careful, patient study, Miss Ashworth. We have perhaps a month to understand everything my brother intended, and to ensure that when this Warden makes his final move, he finds nothing waiting for him except failure. Lyra felt the weight of the timeline settle over her, sharper and more urgent than the vague dread she had carried since the tremor first shook the palace. Whatever fragile safety they had built within these windowless walls, it would not last much longer. Somewhere beyond the palace, a countdown had already begun, and neither she nor Cale could afford to waste a single day of it. A messenger bird crashed against the chamber's outer corridor wall before dawn, its wing broken, a small scroll still bound to its leg despite the impact. Felix brought it directly to Lyra and Cale, his face pale in the torchlight, and by the time they unrolled the message, the entire room seemed to grow colder. The scroll bore no signature, only the crude black symbol they had come to recognize as the Warden's mark, and beneath it, a single line of careful script. Your brother sends his regards, Your Majesty, and reminds you that patience has always been his greatest strength. He is alive, Cale said, his voice flat with barely contained shock. My father's soldiers searched for years and found nothing. And now, 100 years later, he simply announces himself through a wounded bird. Or someone wants you to believe he is alive, Lyra said carefully. Fear of Ronan himself would be a powerful tool for whoever leads the Warden's followers now, whether or not he still draws breath. Cale turned the scroll over, searching for any additional clue, but found nothing beyond the single damning line. There is one way to know for certain, he said finally. The prisoner captured at the eastern gate, he may know more than he initially revealed. They found the young man exactly where Felix had left him days before, thinner now, clearly unsettled by his extended confinement, though his eyes still held a stubborn defiance when Cale entered the cell. Your Warden sent us a message, Cale said without preamble, setting the scroll down before the prisoner. He claims my brother is alive. Is that true? The prisoner's gaze flicked to the scroll, something like genuine surprise crossing his features before he could mask it. I have never seen Ronan Draven with my own eyes, he admitted finally, but the Warden speaks of him as though he still lives, still guides our purpose from wherever he has hidden himself these long years. Where does the Warden believe he is hiding? Lyra asked. Somewhere beyond the eastern wilderness, past the borders your soldiers stopped patrolling decades ago, the prisoner said. There are old ruins out there, remnants of settlements abandoned during the last war, within the bloodline. The Warden has spoken of visiting a hidden sanctuary among those ruins more than once, though he has never taken any of us with him. Cale's expression grew distant, calculating. If Ronan survived all these years, hidden among the ruins of a war he himself started, then he has had a century to plan his return, far longer than any of us anticipated. The star alignment, Lyra said suddenly, connecting the pieces aloud. If he has been waiting for the right conditions to complete his rite, then 100 years of patience makes considerably more sense than 100 years of simple survival. The prisoner nodded slowly. The Warden speaks often of an alignment, of a debt long overdue, that will finally be settled once the missing half of the seal is recovered. And how does he intend to recover it now that we know he is searching? Cale asked. The prisoner hesitated, fear flickering across his young face. There is someone within your own court, he admitted finally. Someone the warden has cultivated for years, long before your archivist ever stumbled upon the Black Seal. I do not know their name. I was never trusted with that information. But I know the warden believes this person will deliver both seals into his hands before the alignment passes, regardless of what precautions the Crown attempts to take. Lyra felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. A conspirator, already embedded within the palace, patient and unseen for years, waiting for exactly this moment. She thought of Edmund Hale's careful, measured answers, of the flicker of recognition that had crossed his face when Cale first mentioned the warden's name, and a cold suspicion began to take root in her chest that she immediately tried to dismiss as unfair. We need to find this conspirator before the alignment arrives, Cale said, his voice hardening with resolve. Every day we delay is another day closer to losing whatever advantage our ignorance of their identity still provides them. They left the cell together, the weight of the prisoner's revelation settling heavily between them as they walked the quiet corridors back toward their hidden study. Lyra's mind raced through every interaction she had witnessed since the tremor first shook the palace, searching for anyone whose behavior had seemed slightly out of place, slightly too convenient, slightly too eager to help, or too careful to avoid suspicion. Edmund Hale, she said finally, forcing herself to voice the suspicion aloud rather than let it fester silently. He knew about the warden's title before either of us mentioned it clearly. He hesitated before answering, just slightly, in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Cale's expression grew troubled. Edmund served my father faithfully for decades. He has no reason to betray this crown now, after everything he sacrificed to help contain my brother the first time. Unless his loyalty was never as certain as it appeared, Lyra said gently, hating the doubt, even as she spoke it aloud. Or unless something changed in the years since, some grievance or debt we know nothing about. I do not want to believe it, Cale admitted, but I cannot afford to dismiss the possibility, simply because the truth would be painful to accept. They reached the hidden chamber and found Clara waiting anxiously near the entrance, having promised to keep watch while they interrogated the prisoner. Her expression shifted immediately to concern at the grim look on both their faces. What happened? She asked. Lyra explained quickly, the confirmation that Ronan might still be alive, the existence of a conspirator embedded within the palace, the growing suspicion surrounding Edmund Hale. Clara listened with careful attention, her sharp mind clearly turning the information over from every angle. If Edmund truly is working against the crown, Clara said slowly, then he has had access to information about your research this entire time. Every conversation, every discovery, everything you have shared with him, could already be in the warden's hands. The realization settled over the room like a physical weight. Lyra thought of the father's journal Edmund had produced so readily, so conveniently, and wondered for the first time whether that generosity had been genuine assistance or a carefully calculated move to keep himself informed of exactly how much they understood. We cannot confront him directly, Cale said finally, thinking aloud. If our suspicions are wrong, we risk losing a loyal advisor's trust for nothing. If our suspicions are correct, direct confrontation will only warn him to cover his tracks more carefully before we can gather proof. Then we watch him, Felix said, entering the chamber in time to catch the tail end of their conversation, quietly, carefully, without revealing that we suspect anything at all. Cale nodded slowly, though the decision clearly weighed on him, the possibility of betrayal from someone who had served his family for decades, cutting deeper than any physical threat the warden's followers had posed so far. Watch him closely, he said finally, and pray, for all our sakes, that our suspicions prove wrong. Lyra looked around the small chamber at the faces gathered there, Felix's grim determination, Clara's quiet worry, Cale's carefully controlled dread, and understood that whatever fragile progress they had made in understanding Ronan's right meant little if the very foundation of their alliance had already been compromised from within. The star alignment drew closer with each passing day, and somewhere within these palace walls, a patient conspirator waited for the perfect moment to strike. Lyra woke to the sound of her own door easing open, a soft click of the latch that should have been impossible, given the lock she checked every night without fail. She lay still for a heartbeat, every muscle tensed, before rolling silently off the far side of her bed and reaching for the small blade Felix had insisted she carry after the break-in at the Western Archive. A shadow moved across the room, careful and deliberate, heading straight for the small writing desk where she kept her research notes. Lyra's grip tightened on the blade, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the intruder would hear it, and she waited until the figure bent low over her papers before speaking. "Looking for something specific," she said, stepping out from the shadows, "or simply hoping to find whatever I happen to leave lying about?" The figure spun, and even in the dim light, Lyra recognized the silver hair and the startled, guilty expression of Edmund Hale. "Miss Ashworth," he said, straightening quickly, though his voice carried none of its usual composed warmth. "I did not mean to alarm you. I only wished to review your latest notes on the star alignment, given the urgency of our situation." "At this hour," Lyra said, through a locked door, without so much as a knock. Edmund's expression shifted, calculation replacing the initial guilt, and Lyra understood in that instant that whatever explanation he offered next would be a careful, practiced lie rather than the truth. "I did not wish to wake you unnecessarily," he began, but Lyra cut him off, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "The prisoner told us there is a conspirator within this court," she said. "Someone the warden has cultivated for years. I did not want to believe it was you, Edmund. I still do not want to believe it, but nothing else explains this." Edmund's careful mask finally cracked, something older and wearier surfacing beneath it. "You do not understand what was taken from me," he said quietly. "What this crown allowed to happen, and never once acknowledged." "Then explain it to me," Lyra said, refusing to lower the blade, despite the tremor in her hand. "My daughter," Edmund said, his voice breaking slightly on the word. 20 years ago, during a border dispute the Crown chose not to intervene in, my daughter was among those lost when a Lycan clan loyal to the old ways raided a human settlement near the Eastern Territories. The Crown called it an unfortunate consequence of maintaining peace with the broader bloodline. I called it an unforgivable betrayal of everyone who trusted this treaty to protect them." Lyra's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy, though it did nothing to loosen her grip on the blade. "And the warden found you in your grief." "He found me in my anger," Edmund corrected. "He promised that once the old balance was corrected, once the bloodline's true strength was restored, without the constraints of a human peace that had already failed my family once, such tragedies would become impossible. No more compromises, no more quiet acceptance of loss in the name of maintaining a fragile treaty." "And you believed restoring Ronan's right would prevent tragedy," Lyra said, "rather than simply causing a different, far larger one." "I believed," Edmund said, "that I had already given this crown everything a father could give, and received nothing in return except empty condolences. When the warden offered a different vision, one that promised such loss would never repeat itself, I did not have the strength left to refuse him." A commotion in the corridor interrupted them before Lyra could respond further, and moments later, Cale burst through the door, Felix close behind him, both clearly alerted by some sound or instinct that had drawn them from their own quarters at this unusual hour. Cale's eyes moved quickly between Lyra and Edmund, understanding settling over his features in an instant. "Edmund," he said, his voice carrying a depth of hurt that cut through even his usual composed authority. "Tell me this is not what it appears to be." Edmund's shoulders slumped, all remaining pretense finally falling away. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. Truly I am. But I cannot continue pretending loyalty to a crown that failed my family when it mattered most." "So you chose to help destroy the entire kingdom instead," Cale said, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "How many innocent families do you believe will suffer if my brother's right succeeds? How does trading one tragedy for 1,000 honor your daughter's memory?" "The warden promised a correction," Edmund said, though his voice wavered with doubt for the first time. "Not destruction, a restoration of the bloodline's true strength, freed from the constraints that failed to protect those I loved most." "And you believed him," Cale said, "despite everything you yourself told us about what my brother's right actually intends. You know better than anyone in this palace what unrestrained bloodline magic did to the Eastern Territories 100 years ago. You witnessed it yourself." Edmund's expression flickered with something like doubt, old grief warring visibly with whatever promises the warden had offered him over the years. I have spent so long believing this was the only path left to me, he admitted quietly, that I am no longer certain I trust my own judgment on the matter. Felix moved forward cautiously, clearly ready to restrain the older man should he attempt to flee. But Edmund made no move toward escape, his posture instead settling into something resembling resignation. How much have you already told the warden? Cale demanded. Everything, Edmund admitted, shame finally overtaking the last of his composure. Every discovery Miss Ashworth shared with me, every passage from your father's journal, every detail of the timeline, and the star alignment. I sent word only yesterday confirming the alignment falls within the coming weeks, exactly as your calculations predicted. Lyra's stomach dropped. Then he knows we are close to understanding the full right. He knows everything I know, Edmund confirmed, which regrettably is nearly everything you have both discovered since the night the tremor first shook this palace. Cale's hands clenched into fists at his sides, fury and betrayal warring plainly across his features, though he forced himself toward calm with visible effort. Lock him in the lower cells, he told Felix finally, separate from the prisoner captured at the eastern gate. I do not want them exchanging information or comparing what little leverage either of them still holds. As Felix led Edmund away, the older man paused at the threshold, glancing back toward Cale with an expression somewhere between shame and desperate hope. For what little it is worth, your majesty, I never wished harm upon you personally. I wished only for an end to the kind of loss that took my daughter from me. Grief does not excuse betrayal, Cale said quietly, though something in his voice suggested the words cost him more than his composed exterior allowed him to show. I am sorry for what you lost, Edmund. I always have been. But you have handed a dangerous enemy every advantage we worked so carefully to deny him. When the door closed behind Felix and his prisoner, Cale turned to Lyra, exhaustion and worry plain across his features now that the immediate danger had passed. How much did he already know before you discovered him tonight? Enough, Lyra said grimly. Enough that the warden likely already knows exactly how close we are to understanding his right, and exactly how much time remains before the alignment he has waited a century to reach finally arrives. Cale sank into the nearest chair, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of genuine exhaustion. Then we no longer have the luxury of careful, patient preparation. Whatever advantage our secrecy provided has just been stripped away entirely. Lyra sat across from him, her own hands finally steady enough to set the blade aside. Then we adapt, she said firmly. We cannot undo what Edmund has already revealed, but we can still control what happens next. The warden may know how close we are, but he does not yet have the seals themselves. That much, at least, remains within our power to protect. Cale looked up at her, something like renewed determination steadying his features, despite the fresh wound of betrayal still visibly raw beneath his composure. Then we protect them, he said, with everything remaining strength this kingdom has left to offer, whatever the cost. A cloth pressed hard over Lyra's mouth before she could scream, and the last thing she remembered clearly was the sharp, sweet scent of something meant to steal her senses away. When awareness returned, slow and disorienting, she found herself seated on cold stone, wrists bound loosely enough to move, but tightly enough to remind her escape was not a realistic option, in a chamber she did not recognize, lit by torches that cast long, flickering shadows against walls carved with symbols, matching the black seal exactly. You are awake, said a voice she did not recognize, calm and almost gentle despite the circumstances. A man stepped into the torchlight, tall and composed, his features bearing an unsettling resemblance to Cale's, though harder around the eyes, colder somehow, as though carved from the same stone, but weathered by a very different storm. Ronan, Lyra said, the name settling into place with cold certainty, even before he confirmed it. You know me, he said, something almost like satisfaction coloring his voice. My brother has spoken of me then. I confess, I am curious what he chose to share. Enough to know what you intend, Lyra said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear pounding through her chest. Enough to know why you sent Edmund Hale to betray his own king. Something flickered across Ronan's expression, brief acknowledgement rather than denial. Poor Edmund. His grief made him useful for a time, though I suspect his usefulness has now expired, given that you are here instead of him. How did you take me? Lyra demanded, testing the bindings at her wrists, despite knowing the effort was likely futile. A message, delivered under my brother's seal, requesting your presence in the eastern garden late this evening, Ronan said, almost pleasant in his explanation, as though discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. Forged, of course, but convincingly enough, it seems, given how readily you arrived alone. Lyra's stomach twisted at the realization of how easily she had been deceived, how quickly her guard had lowered at the mere suggestion of Cale's summons. She thought of the study, of the careful trust they had built together over these past weeks, and felt a fresh wave of fear at how completely that trust had been exploited against her. "Where am I?" she asked. "Somewhere beneath the palace few remember still exists," Ronan said. "A forgotten chamber, sealed away long before my brother took the crown, built originally for exactly the purpose I intend to use it for tonight." Lyra's eyes moved past him toward a stone table at the chamber's center, and her blood ran cold at what rested upon it. Both seals, the crimson and the black, sat side by side, their edges nearly touching, the same faint golden dust she remembered from the vault already beginning to stir in the air around them. "You have both seals already," she said, dread settling deep into her bones. "Then why did you need me at all?" "Because the rite requires a willing bearer from each half of the original pact," Ronan said, his voice growing quietly intense for the first time. "My brother's father recorded that requirement carefully, I am sure, though I suspect he never anticipated how easily willingness could be manufactured through sufficiently compelling circumstances." "I will not help you," Lyra said firmly, "willingly or otherwise." "We shall see," Ronan said, and something in his calm certainty frightened her more than outright violence might have. "The star alignment reaches its peak within the hour. I have waited a century for this moment, Miss Ashworth. I do not intend to let a scholar's stubbornness stand between me and what I have sacrificed everything to achieve." He moved toward the table, drawing a thin blade from his coat, and Lyra's breath caught as she understood, with sudden horrifying clarity, precisely what mechanism he intended to use to force her participation. Not persuasion, not patience, simply the ancient magic's own hunger for blood, willing or otherwise, drawn from someone standing close enough to the human half of the pact to satisfy the rite's requirements. "The magic does not care whether you offer your blood freely," Ronan said, almost apologetically, as he moved closer. "It cares only that it is spilled at the proper moment, beneath the proper alignment, in the proper place. Your willingness, Miss Ashworth, was always a courtesy I hoped to extend, rather than a requirement I could not circumvent." Lyra fought against her bindings with renewed desperation, but the ropes held firm, and Ronan's approach continued unhurried, confident in the inevitability of what was about to unfold. She thought, in that final desperate moment, of Cale's warning weeks ago in that quiet study, that once she understood the full truth of his brother's right, there would be no safe corner of the kingdom left to hide from it. She had not imagined then how literally true those words would become. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her own voice even as she spoke, "think of what this will cost. Not just the crown, every family living within these borders, every life built on the peace your father's generation fought to establish." "I have thought of little else for 100 years, Ronan said quietly, and for just a moment, something almost sorrowful passed behind his cold eyes. "I have watched from the shadows, as this kingdom celebrated a peace built upon my own family's fracture, as my brother wore a crown that should never have required such a painful compromise to secure. Tonight, that compromise ends, one way or another." He raised the blade, and Lyra closed her eyes, bracing herself against the pain and the horror of what was about to be unleashed through her own unwilling blood. But before the blade could fall, the heavy stone door at the chamber's far end exploded inward, with a force that sent dust and debris scattering across the ancient floor, and a voice she recognized instantly, raw with fury and desperate relief, cut through the chaos. "Ronan." Cale stood in the shattered doorway, his eyes blazing amber in the torchlight, every line of his body coiled with barely restrained fury at the sight before him. Behind him, Felix and a handful of palace guards pressed forward, weapons drawn, though their attention remained fixed warily on the two seals, glowing ever brighter atop the stone table. "Brother," Ronan said, turning slowly, the blade still poised in his hand, though his attention had shifted entirely toward the doorway. "You always did have impeccable timing. A shame it will not matter in the end." Lyra's heart pounded as she watched the two brothers face each other across the ancient chamber, a century of grief and betrayal, and unfinished war finally converging in the flickering torchlight, with her own life, and the fate of an entire kingdom, hanging in the fragile balance between them. The golden light between the two seals surged brighter, threads of magic stretching across the stone table like living veins, and Lyra understood with rising dread that the ritual was already beginning to draw strength from the mere proximity of both marks, regardless of whether Ronan's blade ever touched her skin. "Release her," Cale said, stepping fully into the chamber, his voice steady, despite the storm visibly raging behind his eyes. "This ends now, Ronan. Whatever grievance you carry against me, against our father, against this entire kingdom, it does not need to be settled through her blood." "It was never about grievance alone," Ronan said, though he did not move to release Lyra from her bindings. "It is about correction, about restoring what should never have been compromised in the first place. By destroying everything our father spent his life protecting," Cale said, moving slowly closer, careful and deliberate, clearly wary of provoking any sudden movement from his brother's blade. "By condemning countless innocent families to the same chaos that nearly tore these lands apart a century ago." "Chaos is simply strength unrestrained," Ronan said. "You were always too afraid of our own nature to see it clearly, brother. I intend to free what you have spent your entire reign suppressing." The light between the seals pulsed again, stronger now, and the ancient carvings along the chamber walls began to glow faintly in response, as though the very stone remembered the magic it had been built to contain. Felix and the guards shifted uneasily near the shattered doorway, clearly torn between rushing forward and the fear of disrupting whatever fragile balance still held the ritual from completing itself entirely. "The alignment is nearly at its peak," Ronan said, glancing briefly toward a narrow shaft of moonlight filtering down through a crack in the chamber's ceiling, precisely angled to catch the position of stars visible only during this rare occurrence. "Whatever you intend to do, brother, you should do it quickly." Cale's eyes moved from his brother's blade to Lyra's frightened but determined face, and something resolved itself behind his amber gaze, a decision made in the space of a single held breath. "Then let the right take what it truly requires," he said, "and let it take it from me instead." Before anyone could react, Cale crossed the remaining distance in a single fluid motion, seizing his brother's wrist and turning the blade's edge against his own palm, rather than allowing it anywhere near Lyra. Ronan's eyes widened in genuine shock as Cale's blood, dark and immediate, spilled across the table's surface, mingling with the golden threads already stretching between the two seals. "No," Ronan said, something almost like panic breaking through his composed fury for the first time. "You cannot offer yourself as the bearer. The rite requires balance, human and Lycan both, not two of the same bloodline standing in for a pact meant to unite two different peoples." "Then let it fail," Cale said through gritted teeth, pain evident in his voice, though his resolve did not waver. "Let it choke on an offering it cannot properly use." The chamber shuddered violently, the golden light flaring bright and unstable, threads of magic snapping and twisting like something wounded rather than completed. Lyra watched in horrified fascination as the two seals began to pulse erratically, their earlier synchronized glow now fracturing into something chaotic and dangerous, clearly rejecting the imbalance Cale's sacrifice had introduced into the ancient rite. "You are going to destroy us all," Ronan shouted, wrenching his wrist free and stumbling back from the table as cracks began spreading across its stone surface. "Better a fractured failure than your completed victory," Cale said, swaying slightly, his palm still bleeding freely, though his eyes remained fixed and determined, despite the visible toll the sacrifice had already taken. Lyra strained desperately against her bindings, understanding suddenly that Cale's disruption, while preventing the rite's completion, had created an entirely new danger, unstable magic with nowhere proper to discharge itself, threatening to collapse the entire chamber around them all. "The seals need to be separated," she shouted, over the growing roar of unraveling magic. "Physically. Now, before the instability spreads beyond this room." Felix finally broke from his position near the doorway, rushing forward, despite the danger, to slice through Lyra's bindings with a quick, practiced motion. Freed, she scrambled toward the table, ignoring the fractured stone and the wild, erratic light still pulsing between the two seals. "KL, help me," she called, and he staggered forward despite his injury, understanding her intent immediately. Together, working with desperate haste, they pried the two seals apart, physically separating them across the width of the cracking table. and the moment the connecting threads of light finally snapped entirely, the chamber fell into sudden, ringing silence. Ronan stood frozen near the shattered doorway, staring at the now separated, darkened seals with an expression of complete devastation. A century of patient planning, unraveled in a matter of desperate moments. "You have doomed us both," he said quietly, though whether he spoke of himself and his brother, or of the entire bloodline's fractured future, Lyra could not be certain. "I have stopped you," Cale said, breathing hard, cradling his wounded hand against his chest. "That is all I ever intended to do, brother. Not destroy you. Simply stop you before your ambition destroyed everything else." Ronan's gaze moved between his brother's bleeding hand and the two darkened seals now resting safely apart on the cracked stone table, and something in his rigid posture finally seemed to crumble, a century of certainty collapsing into sudden, exhausted doubt. Before Felix or the guards could move to restrain him, he turned and fled through a narrow passage at the chamber's rear, vanishing into the darkness beyond, before anyone could give proper chase. "Let him go," Cale said, when Felix moved to pursue. "For tonight, at least, we have accomplished what mattered most. The rite has failed, and the seals remain separated." Lyra sank against the cracked table, adrenaline finally beginning to drain from her limbs, leaving exhaustion and disbelief in its wake. She looked at Cale, at the blood still seeping from his self-inflicted wound, and felt a fierce, complicated wave of gratitude and worry crash over her all at once. "You should not have done that," she said softly, moving to examine his injured hand, despite her own trembling fingers. "Offering yourself as the bearer. You had no way of knowing how the rite would respond." "I had no better option," Cale said, wincing as she pressed a torn strip of fabric against the wound. "I was not going to let it take your blood, Miss Ashworth, whatever the cost to myself." Something in his voice, quiet and unguarded despite the pain evident in his features, made Lyra's chest tighten with an emotion far too complicated to examine closely in the immediate aftermath of everything they had just survived. She simply nodded, focusing instead on securing the makeshift bandage, grateful beyond words that he had arrived in time, and terrified by how narrowly disaster had been averted. Behind them, Felix began organizing the guards to secure the chamber and search for any trace of where Ronan might have fled, while overhead, the rare star alignment that had driven a century of patient scheming finally began to shift and fade, its brief window of opportunity closing at last, leaving behind only the wreckage of a rite interrupted, and two brothers, whose long, painful conflict remained, despite tonight's victory, far from truly resolved. Word of the shattered chamber spread through the palace before dawn, and by mid-morning, the court had gathered in anxious clusters throughout the great hall, demanding answers the crown had spent decades avoiding. Cale stood before them with his injured hand bound in fresh linen, Lyra at his side, and Felix positioned nearby, with the quiet readiness of a man prepared for the gathering to turn hostile at any provocation. "There will be questions," Cale murmured to Lyra as they waited for the hall to settle. "Many of them uncomfortable, given how carefully my family has guarded this history for a century." "Then answer them honestly," Lyra said. "A kingdom built on secrets nearly collapsed last night. I do not think another decade of careful silence will serve it any better." Cale studied her for a moment, something like resolve settling firmly across his features, before he turned to address the assembled nobles, advisors, and curious servants who had gathered to learn what force had shaken the palace's foundations in the night. He told them everything: the existence of his brother, long erased from the court's official records, the war within the bloodline, that the founding pact had truly been forged to end, the Black Seal's discovery, the Warden's patient conspiracy, Edmund Hale's grief-driven betrayal, and finally, the desperate confrontation that had nearly cost the kingdom everything it had built across 100 years of fragile peace. The hall fell into stunned silence as he finished, nobles exchanging uneasy glances, servants whispering among themselves, the weight of a century's carefully constructed history crumbling in real time before their eyes. Lyra watched Cale's face carefully throughout, searching for any sign of regret at revealing so much, but found instead a kind of quiet relief, as though setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. "What happens now?" one of the senior nobles finally asked, voicing the question clearly weighing on everyone present. "If your brother survives still, and this warden's followers remain scattered but active, how can this kingdom trust that such danger will not return?" "By no longer pretending it does not exist," Cale said firmly. By strengthening the border patrols my father once maintained near the eastern wilderness, by ensuring the histories taught within our schools reflect the truth of our founding, rather than a comfortable fiction, designed to avoid difficult conversations, and by remembering, always, that peace requires vigilance, not simply hope. The assembly slowly began to disperse afterward, murmuring among themselves, some visibly shaken, others already discussing practical measures to strengthen the kingdom's defenses against whatever remained of Ronan's scattered followers. Edmund Hale's fate remained a quieter matter, discussed only among Cale's closest advisors, and in the days that followed, Cale made the difficult decision to spare the older man's life, in exchange for whatever remaining information he could provide about the Warden's network. A mercy Lyra suspected was extended as much for the memory of his lost daughter, as for any strategic value. Weeks passed as the palace slowly settled into its new, more honest equilibrium. Lyra returned to her work in the Royal Archive, though her small hidden office had become something closer to a proper research chamber, staffed now with additional scholars, tasked with untangling the century of deliberately obscured history that her initial discovery had unearthed. Clara worked alongside her often, delighted to finally understand the full truth behind Lyra's mysterious disappearances in the weeks before, and Felix visited regularly, his gruff demeanor softening whenever the conversation turned toward Lyra's continued safety. Cale, too, found reason to visit the archive more often than his royal duties strictly required, and Lyra found herself looking forward to those visits with a warmth she no longer bothered denying to herself, even if she had not yet found the courage to name it aloud. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after the confrontation in the hidden chamber, that Cale found her alone among the shelves, examining a newly recovered fragment of the founding pack's original ceremony, one that painted a far more nuanced picture of the peace between his ancestors than any official record had ever dared preserve. "You have transformed this kingdom's understanding of itself," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her desk. "In a matter of months, you have accomplished what a century of careful silence never could. A reckoning with the truth. I only wanted to understand two old parchments," Lyra said, a small smile touching her lips despite the weight still lingering in her chest whenever she thought of how close disaster had come to unfolding. "I never intended to reshape an entire kingdom's history. And yet here we are," Cale said softly, changed by it regardless. Something in his tone made Lyra look up from the fragment before her, meeting his gaze steadily across the desk. The careful distance they had maintained throughout their weeks of shared danger seemed to soften in that quiet moment, replaced by something warmer, more honest, than either of them had previously allowed themselves to acknowledge. "I owe you my life," Lyra said quietly. "What you did that night, offering yourself to the right, rather than letting it take my blood, I have not forgotten it, and I do not think I ever will. I would do it again," Cale said simply, without hesitation, "if it meant keeping you safe." Lyra felt her breath catch slightly at the quiet certainty in his voice, the unguarded honesty of a man who rarely allowed himself such vulnerability before others. "That is a rather significant admission from a king," she said softly, "given how carefully you guard your composure in front of the wider court." "You are not the wider court," Cale said, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual reserve. "You never have been, Miss Ashworth. Not from the moment you first showed Felix the edge of that crimson seal beneath your shawl." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of everything they had survived settling into something quieter and more hopeful between them, before Cale spoke again, his voice carrying a new kind of uncertainty entirely unrelated to seals or rites or centuries-old conspiracies. "I would like you to remain close to this court," he said carefully, not merely as an archivist assigned to untangle old mysteries, but as someone whose counsel and company I have come to value, beyond what any professional arrangement could properly explain. Lyra's heart quickened at the careful, deliberate phrasing, understanding the deeper question, woven quietly beneath his formal words. "Are you asking me to stay, Your Majesty?" she said, a teasing warmth entering her voice, despite the genuine emotion behind the question. "Or, asking something rather more significant than simple employment?" Cale's smile widened, some of his usual careful composure finally giving way to something closer to genuine, unguarded happiness. "Both, if you will have it," he admitted. "This kingdom owes you a debt it can never fully repay, but I find myself wishing for far more than simple gratitude between us. Lyra, if you are willing to consider it. Lyra set the ancient fragment aside carefully, giving Kale her full and undivided attention, feeling the last of her earlier fear and exhaustion finally give way to something bright and hopeful, blooming steadily in her chest. "I never intended to fall into the middle of a century-old conflict when I opened that vault," she said softly. "But I find I am not sorry it led me here, to this moment, beside you." Outside the archive's tall windows, evening settled gently over the palace grounds, the same grounds that had nearly been torn apart by an ancient rite and a century of buried grief, now standing quiet and unbroken beneath a sky finally free of any dangerous alignment. The kingdom would carry the scars of what nearly happened for years to come, and somewhere beyond its borders, Ronan Draven remained a shadow yet to be fully accounted for. But within the quiet warmth of the archive that evening, two people who had faced destruction together chose instead to build something new between them. A partnership forged not from ancient blood and old magic, but from trust freely given, and courage tested beneath the very real threat of losing everything that mattered most. The kingdom, battered but unbroken, moved forward into an uncertain future, wiser now, for the truths it had finally been forced to face, and stronger, for the choice its people made to meet that future honestly, together, rather than hidden behind another century of careful, comfortable silence.